Hello, I'm doing a DVD collection video, and in this video I'm going to be talking about my favorite horror films that came out in the 1980s. Now, I already did a video similar to this a couple of years ago, but I recently took my old 1980s horror films video down because I really wanted to redo it. So, once again, this is my DVD collection video where I'll be talking about my favorite horror movies from the 1980s. Now, the 1980s really was kind of a golden age for horror films. You had a lot of really great horror films come out during this decade. A lot of really groundbreaking horror films came out during the 1980s, and also a lot of big horror franchises started in the 1980s, like the Friday the 13th franchise, but you also had some franchises that didn't necessarily start in the 1980s, but they became franchises in the 80s. An example would be Halloween. The first Halloween movie came out in the 70s, however all the sequels, or most of the sequels, came out in the 1980s, so even though the Halloween franchise technically started in the 1970s, it didn't actually become a franchise until the 1980s. But not just did you have some great franchise pieces from the 1980s, but you also had a lot of really good standalone horror films as well. So, the 1980s was a great time for horror films. It was really a great time for movies in general because, besides horror films, you also had some great action films come out in the 1980s. You had a lot of really good drama films come out during this decade, and a lot of really good comedies. However, in this video, I'm primarily focusing on horror movies. The first movie I want to talk about is a 1980 film called Don't Go in the House. Now, this movie officially came out in 1980, however, I believe it was released in France in 1979, so this film, in a weird way, kind of counts as both a 1979 film and a 1980 film, and I actually talked about this movie before in my video of my favorite horror films from the 1970s, because, once again, this movie I kind of consider to be both a 1970s film and a 1980s film. Now, Don't Go in the House is a really good movie. It's about this guy who was abused by his mother when he was a little kid, and now as an adult he's become a serial killer, and basically he kidnaps women and he takes them to his house, and he actually has this room in his house that is fireproof, and he actually burns these women alive in this room. But Don't Go in the House is a really good movie, and I actually heard that Quentin Tarantino is apparently a really big fan of this movie. Now, the movie does have a very similar premise to Maniac, and the movie even has a very similar ending to Maniac, and this movie did come out a little bit before Maniac, and I'm not trying to say that William Lustig and Joe Spinell ripped Maniac off from this movie, but it is definitely a hell of a coincidence, but I personally think it was just a coincidence. Like, I don't think that William Lustig and Joe Spinell ripped Maniac off from this movie. I think it's just like a coincidence that the two films happen to be made around the same time. And in speaking of Maniac, Maniac is the next movie I want to talk about. Now, Maniac came out in 1980, and the film is directed by William Lustig and is written by Joe Spinell, and Joe Spinell also plays the main villain of the movie, who is also the main character of the film. Now, Joe Spinell is the same guy who played the loan shark character in the first two Rocky movies, and he was also in The Godfather as well. Now, in the movie, Joe Spinell plays this character named Frank Zito, who is a serial killer who goes out and primarily kills women, and he actually scalps the women that he kills, and he, like, puts their hair on these mannequins that he keeps at his apartment. It's really freaking creepy. It's a really creepy and disturbing movie, and this movie was actually quite controversial when it came out back in 1980. Tom Savini also does the makeup effects in this movie, and Tom Savini also has a brief cameo appearance in this movie as well. The movie also stars Caroline Munro, who is in a lot of the Hammer films, and both Caroline Munro and Joe Spinell would go on to be in the movie The Last Horror Film, which I would say is kind of a spiritual sequel to this film. That is also a really good film as well. I'm not talking about it in this video only because it's not one of my favorites, but that is also a really good one. The next movie I want to talk about is Cannibal Holocaust. Now, I already did a review on this movie a little over a year ago now, so if you want to know more of my opinions on this film, just check out that review I did a little over a year ago. But Cannibal Holocaust is a really good movie. This is an Italian exploitation film, which was actually very controversial when it came out, because the kill sequences in this movie are so brutally realistic looking that people actually thought that the director of this movie actually killed these people. Like, people actually thought that this was a snuff film, so he was actually arrested, and he actually had to have all the actors who were in this movie come into court to prove to the courts that he did not murder these people. Now, this movie is also very controversial because in this film, they actually kill real animals, and even though I love this movie, that's the one aspect of the movie that I absolutely cannot defend. So while I do love the movie, I can completely understand why somebody would hate this movie because of the fact that they kill real animals for the sake of entertainment, and that is the one thing that I do not like about this film. But besides that, like, looking past that, I do think this is a really good movie, and once again, I did a review on this movie a while back, so just check out that review if you want to know more of my opinions on this film. The next movie I want to talk about is The Changeling. The Changeling is a really good movie, and not just is this a really creepy horror film, but it's also a really good drama film as well. It's really a film about grief and about loss. Basically, it's about this pianist played by George C. Scott who loses his wife and daughter to a terrible car accident, and what ends up happening is he ends up moving into this old mansion, and basically he starts getting haunted by a ghost, and that's all I want to say about the plotline of this movie, but this is a really, really good movie, and somewhere down the line I might do a standalone review on this movie because there is actually a lot that I do want to say about this movie. The next movie I want to talk about is Humanoids from the Deep, which also goes by the title Monster. Now, this is a great movie. Now, this is about these sea monsters that come to land and attack and rape women so they can impregnate the women and continue on their species, and this is a brutal, brutal freaking movie, and a lot of the rape sequences in this movie are actually actually really disturbing and really hard to watch, but it is a really good horror film though, so I would definitely recommend Humanoids from the Deep, aka Monster, if you haven't seen this movie already. The next movie I want to talk about is The Fog, which was co-written and directed by John Carpenter, and this I actually think is one of John Carpenter's most underrated films, and truthfully, and I might get lynched for saying this, I actually like this better than Halloween. Now, The Fog is about this town in California that 100 years ago, the founding fathers of this town actually killed this entire leper colony, and now 100 years later, the ghosts of these lepers have come back to take revenge on the descendants of the people who killed them. The Fog is a really good movie, and it actually has kind of an EC feel to it. Like, it almost feels like an elongated Tales from the Crypt comic strip only put to film. And the film stars Janet Leigh and Jamie Lee Curtis and Tom Atkins and Adrienne Barbeau and Al Holbrook. The next movie I want to talk about is a Ken Russell film called Altered States, which I actually really like this movie. I know some people don't like it, but I happen to really enjoy the film, and I find it to be a really unique sci-fi horror film. The next movie I want to talk about is The Shining. Now, The Shining was co-written and directed by Stanley Kubrick, and this is based on the novel by Stephen King. Now, I'm a huge Stephen King fan, but the book The Shining is actually one of the few Stephen King novels that I still have not yet read. Now, I know Stephen King hates this movie because of how different it is from the book. Now, even though I still have not yet read the book that this movie is based on, I am aware of a lot of the major differences between this movie and the book, and I know the book The Shining was a very personal novel for Stephen King, so to a certain extent, I can understand why Stephen King does not like this film. But even though this might not be a very good adaptation of the book, I still think it's a great movie and is definitely one of the best horror films to come out in the 1980s, and I think is also one of Stanley Kubrick's best films, and I also think Jack Nicholson's performance in this movie as the character of Jack Torrance is one of the creepiest villain performances in movie history. The next movie I want to talk about is Christmas Evil. Now, this is a Christmas-themed horror film, and this is definitely one of my favorite Christmas-themed horror films. Basically, this is about this guy who is so obsessed with Christmas and so obsessed with Santa Claus that he actually ends up becoming so lost in his own fantasies that he actually starts to believe that he is Santa Claus himself. And despite what this cover might lead you to believe, this is actually a very, very psychological film, and it's really about this character's mental decline, and it's about this character descending into madness. It really is a great psychological horror film. Now, I have the movie on this Blu-ray/DVD set from Vinegar Syndrome, and I also have the movie on this public domain set right here called Chilling Classics, which is a 50 movie pack featuring 50 different horror films. The next movie I want to talk about is Friday the 13th. 13th. Now, Friday the 13th, this movie to me really is the quintessential slasher film. Like, this is the slasher film that a lot of the cliches and stereotypes that people think of when they think of slasher films really came from this movie, but this movie does them well. Now, the movie itself was meant to be kind of a cash-in on Halloween. However, this is the movie which really did start that slasher movie boom in the early 1980s, and even though the film itself was meant to be a cash-in on Halloween, really this is the film that spawned all the rip-offs and all the knockoffs and cash-ins. And I actually think the original Friday the 13th is a much more well-made and well-acted movie than people really give it credit for. And it's also a very creepy movie, too. Like, that scene in this movie where the character of Brenda is in her cabin and she hears what sounds like a little boy's voice crying, "Help me, help me." That scene is just creepy as hell, and of course at the end of the movie you realize that it was Mrs. Voorhees mimicking her son Jason's voice. But yeah, the original Friday the 13th is a classic in my opinion, and in my opinion it's a much creepier and far more well-made and well-acted movie than people really give it credit for. And also, the characters in this movie I think are actually very likable and very memorable as well. And it's funny that when this movie came out, nobody thought that this movie was gonna do well, and this film, as I said, started the whole slasher movie boom in the early 1980s, and it spawned an entire franchise which has arguably become one of the biggest franchises in horror movie history. The next movie I want to talk about is the sequel to Friday the 13th, Friday the 13th Part 2, which I actually put right on par with the first one. In my opinion, this one is just as good as the first Friday the 13th movie. Now, this copy of the movie that I have is actually signed by Warrington Gillette, who played Jason. Technically, he played Jason at the end of the movie, because now throughout most of the movie Jason wears a sack over his head, but at the end of the movie you see Jason without the sack on his head, and in that scene he's played by an actor named Warrington Gillette, but the actor who played Jason throughout most of the movie was actually an actor named Steve Dashowitz, but Warrington Gillette was the one who was credited as playing Jason throughout the whole movie. Now, I don't really know this for sure, but apparently for years Warrington Gillette was going around saying that he played Jason throughout the whole movie, which, according to everything I hear, was not actually true. Now, when I met the guy, he was a really nice guy when I met him, but I do think that's a little... I do feel like he should at least admit that he didn't play Jason throughout the whole movie, though. At least that's how I feel. He was still a nice guy when I met him. But yeah, I love Friday the 13th Part 2, and as I said, in my opinion, this is just as good as the first one. The next movie I want to talk about is yet another Friday the 13th movie, and that is Friday the 13th Part 3, and this is also the first Friday the 13th movie where Jason got his iconic hockey mask, which he actually doesn't get until halfway through this movie. And Friday the 13th Part 3 also has some really likable characters in it, like the character of Shelly, who is a freaking awesome character who you really do feel for throughout most of this movie. And then there's those two hippie characters in the movie who are freaking awesome, and I also really liked the main character of this movie, Chris. I thought she was a really likable protagonist who actually has kind of a dark backstory. The next movie I want to talk about is yet another Friday the 13th movie, and that is Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter. Keep in mind that the next couple of movies that I'm going to be talking about are going to be Friday the 13th movies, because if I'm doing a video talking about my favorite horror films from the 1980s, I cannot not talk about the Friday the 13th movies, because the Friday the 13th series, I have such nostalgia for this series, because this is a series of films that I used to watch all the time when I was a little kid, and yes, to be fair, I was probably too young to be watching these movies when I first started watching them, but if I did not start watching them at the age I did, I don't know if I would have the same love for this franchise that I do now. But Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter is also a really good addition to the series. Now, this one was called Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter because this was actually meant to be the final Friday the 13th movie, but of course we all know that wasn't the case. And this movie actually has a very young Crispin Glover in it, and it also has Corey Feldman in it as the character of Tommy Jarvis. This begins what a lot of Friday the 13th fans like to call the Tommy Jarvis trilogy, because the next two Friday the 13th movies that came after this would feature the character of Tommy Jarvis. The next movie I want to talk about is Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning, and I love this one. I know a lot of people really don't like this one, but I happen to really enjoy this one, and I actually like that this movie tried to do something different with the Friday the 13th franchise, and actually tried to take the series in a different direction. Unfortunately, they really didn't continue with a lot of the stuff that they set up in this movie, but I still really like this one a lot, and I like how this one tries to be more of a psychological character study on the character of Tommy Jarvis, and it's really about the character of Tommy Jarvis dealing with the psychological trauma of the events that happened in Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter, and it's a much more psychological film than you might be expecting from a Friday the 13th sequel, and also Jason was not the killer in this one, which I think is one of the reasons why a lot of people really did not like this one, but as I said, I personally love Friday the 13th Part 5. The next movie I want to talk about is Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives. Now, my copy of the movie was actually signed by Tom Matthews. I met Tom Matthews a couple of years ago, and he signed this copy of the movie for me. Now, Tom Matthews plays the character of Tommy Jarvis in this one. Now, Friday the 13th Part 6 is actually kind of a horror comedy, and the film almost acts as kind of a spoof on the whole Friday the 13th franchise, yet it's still in continuity with the rest of the series, and the film is also kind of a parody on the slasher film genre in general. This movie actually does a lot of the same things that Scream would do later on, but personally, I think it does it 10 times better than Scream did. And this movie also has a great soundtrack as well. The next movie I want to talk about is Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood. Now, this is the first Friday the 13th movie where Kane Hodder played Jason, and also Jason's look in this movie is probably my favorite look for Jason. Now, if you were to explain the plotline of this movie to somebody who hasn't seen it, they would probably say that sounds like the stupidest premise in the world, but believe it or not, not, this movie takes a really ridiculous premise, but actually does it really well, and this movie actually takes itself pretty seriously, and it actually works. Now, from everything I've heard, this movie was apparently originally going to be a Freddy vs. Jason movie, but I guess they couldn't secure the rights to Freddy Krueger from New Line Cinema, so instead of doing a Freddy vs. Jason movie, they ended up doing a Carrie vs. Jason movie. So in this movie, Jason battles a girl with telekinetic powers, but of course it's not actually Carrie White from Carrie. In this movie, the girl's name is Tina Shepard, who is definitely one of my favorite Friday the 13th protagonists, at least next to Tommy Jarvis, and Friday the 13th Part 7, I love. The premise, yes, the premise is ridiculous. Jason battling a girl with telekinetic powers. It's a ludicrous premise, but somehow this movie does it well, and also I think this is a very well-acted movie too, especially the girl who plays Tina Shepard in this movie. I believe the actress's name is Laura Park Lincoln, and she does a great job in this movie, and I really do think it's one of the best Friday the 13th movies. Now, I do like Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, but it's probably my least favorite out of all the Friday the 13th movies that came out in the 80s, so I'm not going to be talking about it in this video, but the first 7 Friday the 13th movies I absolutely love. The next movie I want to talk about is Mother's Day, which is a trauma film. Now, Mother's Day is directed by Charles Kaufman, who I'm pretty sure is Lloyd Kaufman's brother. Now, I actually really do like Mother's Day. I know some people don't like it, but I happen to really enjoy this one, and I think part of my enjoyment of this one might be nostalgia, because I actually first saw this movie when I was a little kid, so this is a movie that I really remember from when I was a little kid, and a few years ago I came across a copy of this movie at a horror convention, and when I saw a copy of this, I was like, that is mine now. But once again, I really like Mother's Day. To a certain extent, I can understand why some people wouldn't like this one, but I happen to really enjoy it. The next movie I want to talk about is a very underrated film called Fade to Black. Now, this is about this 20-something-year-old young man who is obsessed with movies, and he lives with his abusive aunt, and he suffers a lot of abuse from his aunt, and he's also treated like crap by people at his job, and really movies are like his only escapism from what he perceives as his really horrible life. But eventually in the movie he just snaps and starts killing people. But Fade to Black is a really, really good movie, and the main character of this movie, Eric, is played by Dennis Christopher, who is very creepy in this movie, but is also strangely sympathetic as well. And this movie also has a very early appearance from Mickey Rourke. I think this was actually Mickey Rourke's first movie, actually. The next movie I want to talk about is Prom Night, which stars Jamie Lee Curtis and Leslie Nielsen. Now, Prom Night is a really good movie. Basically, it's about this killer who is stalking and killing all these high school students on prom night, but these high school students that the killer is going after, when they were little kids, they were teasing this little girl, and they accidentally killed this little girl, and let's just say that the reason they're being killed has something nothing to do with this little girl, but Prom Night is a really good movie. The next movie I want to talk about is Hello Mary Lou, Prom Night 2, which is really a sequel to Prom Night in name only. Like, really the only thing that this movie has in common with the first one is I think it's supposed to be the same high school, but besides that, this is really kind of a sequel in name only, and the first Prom Night film was a slasher film. This is really more of a ghost story. Now, Prom Night 2 came out in 1987, and the best way I can describe this film is it's basically like Carrie meets A Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, the plot of Hello Mary Lou is it's about this guy who, when he was a teenager, he caught his girlfriend cheating on him, and then he tried to play a prank on his girlfriend, but this prank went horribly, horribly wrong, and he ended up accidentally killing her. Now, of course, nobody knew that he had anything to do with her death, but now, years later, he's the principal of this high school, and what happens is the ghost of his girlfriend ends up coming back and taking possession of his son's girlfriend. The next movie I want to talk about is actually yet another Michael Ironside movie, and that is Scanners. Now, Scanners is written and directed by David Cronenberg, and Scanners is a great movie. Now, I know this movie actually had a couple of sequels made to it. The only sequel to this movie that I've actually seen was Scanner Cop, which I believe was the fourth Scanners movie, but the first Scanners film is a classic and is definitely one of David Cronenberg's best films, even though David Cronenberg did movies later on, which I do actually like better than this one, but Scanners is still a great film. The next movie I want to talk about is City of the Living Dead, which is directed by Lucio Fulci. Now, this is an Italian horror film, and this is a really good movie. Basically, in this movie, the gates of hell are about to open up, and if the gates of hell open up, it will pretty much be the end of the world as we know it, and the movie follows this reporter and this psychic who are now trying to stop the gates of hell from opening up. It's a really, really good movie, and this also has one particular gore scene, which is one of the grossest gore scenes I've ever seen in a movie. Basically, in the movie, there's this scene where this girl literally pukes her guts out, and every time I watch this movie, I nearly gag every time I see that scene. It's such a gross and disgusting scene, and it's definitely one of the best gore scenes in horror film history, in my opinion. But yeah, City of the Living Dead is a really good movie. The next movie I want to talk about is The Beyond, which is another Lucio Fulci movie, and basically this is about this woman who inherits this hotel, but it turns out that this hotel is actually built over one of the 7 gates of hell, and this is actually kind of a spiritual sequel to City of the Living Dead, but The Beyond is a really good movie as well. The next movie I want to talk about is yet another Lucio Fulci movie, and that is The House by the Cemetery. Now, this is about this psychiatrist who moves into this mansion with his wife and son after a colleague of his kills himself in that mansion, and basically in the movie the son is seeing the ghost of this little girl, and it turns out that there's a monster in the basement of the house. It's a really good movie and a really creepy movie as well. The next movie I want to talk about is yet another Lucio Fulci movie, and that is The Black Cat. Now, this is based on the Edgar Allan Poe short story of the same name, but this is very loosely based on that short story because I've read the short story that this movie is based on, and the movie barely follows the short story. Well, then again, it was a short story. It was only a few pages long, and this is a full-length movie, so obviously they did have to change some things, but really the only thing that this movie has in common with the short story by Edgar Allan Poe is really the ending. Now, the plot of The Black Cat is it follows this police inspector who is investigating a series of what appears to be very fatal accidents, but it turns out that all these accidents are somehow linked with this black cat. The next movie I want to talk about is Southern Comfort, which is a Walter Hill movie, and this is an excellent movie. Basically, the best way I can describe this movie is it's basically a backwoods horror film mixed with a military action film, and it's freaking awesome. Now, the plot of Southern Comfort is it's about these men who work for the National Guard who end up entering the swamps of Louisiana, and because of a very bad misunderstanding, these men end up in all-out war with the people who live in these swampy areas, and you would think that because these men were trained by the military, you would think that they would kick these people's asses, but no, it's the exact opposite. But Southern Comfort is a really good movie, and I highly recommend it. Now, I'm going to end this video off here, and I'm going to continue with a part 2, so definitely stay tuned for part 2 of this video, and bye.